The Undergraduate Research Library Fellowship offers a unique opportunity for undergraduate students to delve deeply into their research interests with the support of NUS libraries. Each fellow receives a stipend ranging from $2,500 to $4,000 to aid them through the course of their project. Our fellows worked with assigned mentors from NUS libraries who have provided research support and guidance on source materials available in our collections. As a part of this fellowship, our fellows also get to showcase their research and share their experiences through this symposium. We are proud to support the rigorous academic exploration and diverse perspectives that our fellows bring to their work. Our fellows have utilized the resources and support provided by the library, but the views and conclusions expressed in their research are their own. Today's symposium will feature 6 fellows, each presenting their research for 10 minutes. After all the presentations, we will have 30 minutes for the audience to engage with the fellows, ask questions, or discuss their findings in greater detail. So now, let us commence with our first fellow, Dakshayani, who will share her research on understanding legal consciousness amongst Sri Lankan migrant domestic workers in Singapore. Dakshayani, please.
Thank you, Diana. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, can everyone see my screen and my presentation? Okay, perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to NUS Libraries and the donors for this incredible opportunity. I would also like to thank my library mentor, Ms. Bisi Itak, and my supervisors, Dr. Chan and Dr. Chua, for their guidance and support, which strengthened my research process. As you can see, my project studies the legal of Sri Lankan migrant domestic workers in Singapore. Briefly, legal consciousness refers to the ways in which people think and act in relation to the law, including situations in which they view the law as relevant and useful, and those in which they reject or never consider it at all. So my presentation will be organized into 3 parts. First, I will provide a summary of my research. Second, I will discuss how I utilized NUS Libraries resources. And third, I will provide my reflections on the fellowship. As a small note, all names used here are pseudonyms to protect the anonymity and confidentiality of my interlocutors. So turning to the first part of my presentation, during one of my first few interviews, one of my interlocutors shared this quote with me here that we can see on the screen. And from then on, it became evident to me that Sri Lankan migrant domestic workers are not a monolithic group. Willingness to invoke their rights in the face of mistreatment varies greatly. And based on this observation, I asked the following research questions. First, how do Sri Lankan MDWs perceive their rights and how do they respond to rights infringements? Second, what accounts for the difference in rights practices and legal consciousness amongst this group despite their shared cultural background and positionality as an MDW? Now, in asking these questions, I believe that my paper bridges key gaps in the migration and legal consciousness literature. And by bridging this gap, I believe that my paper can have important policy implications. Namely, by understanding how law empowers and limits MDWs, this can inform policy reform. So to answer my research question, I conducted in-depth interviews with 12 Sri Lankan migrant domestic workers. And based on these interviews, I found that firstly, my interlocutors adopted various rights practices in response to rights infringements. And second, there were several factors which accounted for the difference in legal consciousness among Sri Lankan migrant domestic workers. So I found that my interlocutors experienced the following rights violations that we can see here on the screen. And most of my interlocutors were aware of their formal rights on paper, meaning they knew that they had the right to a day off, they knew that they had the right to compensation and medical treatment. But this knowledge did not always translate to legal action. Instead, I found that they responded in the following varied ways to their rights infringement. Now, I'll go through each of these tactics briefly by drawing on my interlocutor stories. So the first tactic is lumping. So during lumping, MDWs often minimize their employer's mistreatment. So here we can see on the screen that although Kala's employer was violating her rights, she did not blame her employer and instead chose to sympathize with her and even justify her abuses. The second approach is the wait and see approach. I call this approach silent suffering. It means being aware of the rights violation, but choosing not to remedy it. So from the screen, we can see that when I asked Shrinka what she wanted to do about her employer's rights violations, she replied in the following way, which resembles the wait and see approach. I'll just give everyone a moment to read this quote. Okay. And next, we have everyday resistance. Now, this is a powerful method of self-help which allows MDWs to improve their oppressive circumstances without having to confront, report, or sue their employers. So, for example, in response to the isolation they face, many MDWs may steal some freedom when they walk their employers' dogs or bring their employers' children down to the playground. And there they meet other MDWs who pass them food or prepaid phone card to meet their basic needs. And next, we have negotiation with employers. And this is seen with Diniti, which you can see on the screen, who describes how she demands payment of medical fees from her employer. While this is met with a long face and resistance from her employer, Diniti is not opposed to asking them a little bit more firmly. Here, she confidently adopts a strong rights discourse. They are unhappy, but I have a right to ask, so I ask. Some MDWs even point towards specific rights in their employment contracts during negotiation, which shows a considerable amount of confidence in invoking their rights. Next, we have desertion. So desertion is the most popular response where rights violations are severe. So as from the previous slide, while Diniti was aware of her legal rights, she did not turn to the law because she was afraid that her employers would blacklist her or terminate her contract before she got her affairs in order. So that's why a lot of MDWs actually prefer to desert rather than negotiate with their employer or sue their employer or report them to MOM. The second last step that we have is reporting to MOM or the Sri Lankan embassy. Sorry. So some MDWs were willing to report their employers to law enforcement bodies, but only if they experience grave rights violations. And lastly, we're suing. Now, all interlocutors were unwilling to bring a claim against the employer, notwithstanding the seriousness of the rights infringement. So MDWs may be unwilling to sue for several reasons. Some include lack of knowledge of legal assistance, unfamiliarity with technical legal processes, and language barriers. However, when probed further, some MDWs were willing to take action if they had the resources, such as a free lawyer or, free access to legal information, etc. So thus my research actually shows that Sri Lankan MDWs respond in different ways to rights infringement. This then begs the following follow-up question: what accounts for the difference in legal consciousness within this group? Why do some MDWs respond in one way while others respond in a different way, right? So I argue that what accounts for this difference are structural and subjective factors which shape their identities and consequently their legal consciousness. There's a strong interlink between identity and legal consciousness. So in my research, I actually studied how the following 5 factors influence MDW's identity. I further argue that identity can have paradoxical effect on an MDW's legal consciousness. So on one hand, it can encourage MDWs to engage in more informal and hidden rights practices, such as lumping everyday resistance and desertion. But on the other hand, it can encourage MDWs to engage in more overt and formal rights practices, such as negotiating, reporting, and suing their employers. Thus, identity can be a site of paradox because it cuts both ways. So in the interest of time, I'll just be focusing on how one of these 5 factors, which I discussed in my paper. So the factor that I'll be talking about is the role of daughter, wife, and mother, which many MDWs actually share and are often the sole breadwinners for their families back home. So, however, their identity as a breadwinner can have 2 distinct effects on their legal consciousness depending on the individual. On one hand, because they are breadwinners, MDWs perceive that their family's survival depends on their employer. Accordingly, the employer-employee relationship becomes more hierarchical and unequal, thereby preventing MDWs from asserting their rights through negotiating, reporting, and suing. And this can be seen from the following quote that one of my interlocutors actually shared with me. But for others, the very fact that they identify as a breadwinner can encourage them to engage in claims making, especially if the rights infringement threaten their earning potential. And this was observed in Shania, one of my interlocutors, who was actually willing to sue her employer if there was non-payment of a salary or if she sustained a serious workplace injury. So as a breadwinner, Shania was desperate to recover any money she was owed, driving her to assert her rights through formal legal mechanisms. So here are some of the key points from my research, which I've tried to go through during the earlier part of my presentation. I will now be moving on to the next section, which is discussing how I utilize NUS Library's resources. So while my findings were based on the primary data I collected through interviews, I actually heavily relied on NUS Library's resources to provide the necessary background for my research. So for instance, I reviewed journal articles and books to explain how the legal regime governing MDWs enhances their precarity and restricts their agency to assert their rights. I also reviewed statutes and reports by NGOs to understand the rights available to MDWs and how they may enforce it. I was able to provide this context to my research because of the easy accessibility of resources provided by NUS libraries. Next, we also know that good research always fills a gap in the literature. So in order to contribute meaningfully to the literature, I had to read up on the existing legal consciousness literature, which was what my project was grounded upon. So in particular, I studied the legal consciousness of marginalized groups. I found that the marginalized individuals often adopted the following rights practices. These rights practices was adopted by different marginalized groups, from sex workers in China to disabled folks in America. And I draw on the studies of some scholars like Abrego, Engel and Munger, Boyton, etc. So during my research, I actually found that Sri Lankan NDWs adopted some of those rights practices that were mentioned in the literature. However, they also adopted separate and different rights practices, such as desertion and wait and see. Wait and see is actually a term which I coined during my research. So thus, using NUS Library's resources, I was able to show how I drew on and built upon the existing literature. And this is just a screenshot of my full bibliography. As you can see, there are like about 100 papers here. All of these resources were made available to me because of NUS libraries. And finally, to wrap up, I thought I'd share some of the reflections on the fellowship briefly. Firstly, I was very grateful for Ms. Bissy Ithak, who taught me tips and tricks which streamline the research process. As an aspiring scholar, while I love learning and also doing research, it can still be a very daunting and overwhelming process. Her guidance on appropriate keyword searches and materials to look at was incredibly helpful. Second, I was grateful to my supervisors, Dr. Chan and Dr. Chua, who discussed my findings with me and provided feedback on my drafts. And third, I am thankful to the donors for this generous support and funding. During interviews, I used the funding to buy some snacks to create a hospitable environment for my interlocutors to share their stories. And after the interview, I gave my interlocutors a $10 NTUC voucher as a token of appreciation for their time and effort. I often interviewed these migrant domestic workers on their only day off in the week or even in the month. As such, it was very important for me to compensate them adequately, and as such, I was grateful for the funding given by this fellowship, which allowed me to conduct my research in an ethical and respectful manner. And lastly, I was also grateful for the opportunity to interact with other aspiring scholars and learn about the fascinating and interdisciplinary works that they were researching on, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it during the rest of the symposium. I've now come to the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to field any questions during the Q&A later. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Shayani. I think it's a very imperative research to be done because migrant domestic workers, especially women and Sri Lankan women to be exact, are very much under researched. Okay, so now the next presentation is from Lance, whose topic is on recontextualizing lazy Malay images in 19th century Malaya through the lives of Frank Swettenham and Isabella Bird. Unfortunately, Lance is in the sky somewhere on a plane as we speak. So we will now play a recording of his presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lens. I'm a final year history major with a minor in Southeast Asian Studies. Today, I'll be presenting on my research done over the past semester for both the NUS Library Undergraduate Research Fellowship and my honours thesis, which is entitled Who Says They Are Lazy? Recontextualizing Representations of Alleged Malay Indolence in 19th Century Malaya through the lives and works of Frank Swettenham and Isabella Bird. So this is the scope of my presentation for today. Firstly, let us look at the research gaps in historicizing the myth of the lazy Malay, and to possibly interrogate the myth of the lazy native. So the main literature on the myth of the lazy native comes from Syed Hussein Alatas's seminal work, The Myth of the Lazy Native, published in 1977. Within the work, Alatas argues that the problematic images of lazy Malays and other natives emerge from an ideology of colonial capitalism. This ideology of colonial capitalist exploitation effectively allowed colonial agents to attain moral and economic superiority over the natives and justified their colonial rule in Southeast Asia. Despite the immense impact and influence of his seminal work, his arguments and claims possess some weaknesses on both methodological and contextual grounds. Firstly, Alatas essentialized and grouped three very distinct people groups, the Malays, Javanese, and Filipinos, into one study, without accounting for the very different contexts and historical trajectories experienced by each community. Secondly, he discredited and lacked full consideration of what he saw as unscholarly and unobjective colonial sources, possibly causing him to both leave out and misinterpret these sources. Finally, Alatas also ironically stereotyped the colonial agents who he claims to have extensively stereotyped the Malays and other natives in Southeast Asia, causing him to lack nuance in examining the differentiated colonial agents' lives and experiences. I aim to improve upon Alatas's arguments and frameworks through my modified framework of colonial experiencing, where I extensively analyze the lives, contexts, and experiences of two prominent colonial agents to make sense of their discourses regarding the lazy Malay. Firstly, I revisit Alatas's source base and reanalyze his sources, mainly through the writings of Frank Swettenham and Isabella Bird, and recontextualize their ideas of laziness. Secondly, I focus extensively on the differentiated subjectivities of Frank Swettenham, a colonial administrator, and Isabella Bird, a female traveller. This focus on subjectivity also allowed me to improve upon existing scholarly frameworks of imperial careering and new imperial history. Particularly, I zoomed in on the differentiated life experiences of Swettenham and Bird and the subsequent differentiated images of laziness that resulted. A colonial experience analyzes the widespread exposure, context, and interactions with the Malays, which resulted in the emergence of disparate discourses of laziness internalized by highly differentiated colonial agents. So the following slides contain a summary of my research findings. Frank Swettenham was a very prolific British administrator in Malaya. He was Resident General of the Federated Malay States in 1895 and became Governor of the Straits Settlements in 1901 till his retirement from Malaya in 1904. Alatas criticized Swettenham's writings and his portrayal of the Malays as lazy, which will be outlined in the next slide. However, what other opinions did Swettenham possess that could possibly have been missed out by Alatas as crucial pieces of evidence? Through my reading of Swettenham's works and his life, I deduced that he simultaneously possessed not only ruthless ambition in his career, but also feelings of inferiority in colonial administration. He desired to become the preeminent colonial scholar administrator after his retirement, as he was ineligible for pension despite his 30 years of colonial service in Malaya. This resulted in him needing to legitimize his work by heavily referencing his forebears regarding Malay laziness, who mentioned these characteristics such as William Marston, Thomas Stamford Raffles, etc. From this, we can see that he was likely financially motivated as he needed to sell his colonial experiences and career through his writings to finance his retirement. So from this first quote, we can see that Swettenham did possess some derogatory opinions of the Malays, mentioning that they are lazy to a degree. However, Swettenham's other writings seem to be less condescending, suggesting that the supposed laziness of the Malays was merely a rational response to their environmental and social realities. This includes responding to unscrupulous people who might take away excess wealth, resulting in the accumulation of wealth being a mere waste of energy. These are only a few examples that I picked out, but his other writings also reveal very similar results. So let's move away from Swettenham for a bit and look at Isabella Bird. Similar to Swettenham, Alatas similarly criticized Bird's demeaning discourses regarding Malay women's domestic duties in the household and claimed that she had internalized ideologies of colonial capitalism. However, this conclusion cannot be simply made when her life is more heavily scrutinized. She was diagnosed with a spinal growth and went through various operations from when she was 18, and her doctors at various stages of her life described her with sea voyages and travel to alleviate her pain and medical complications. It was likely that she also experienced multiple episodes of pain during this time. I examined Bird's life through her identity as a woman, which allowed her to gain exclusive access to the domestic and female realms of Malay life. This possibly resulted in greater empathy and understanding when she interacted and made observations of the Malays. So this quote was used by Alatas to denounce Bird's demeaning attitude towards Malay women's lack of initiative to work beyond domestic duties. However, I believe that Alatas misrepresented Bird in this quote, and it is more likely that Bird believed that they were not only hardworking in their domestic duties, but also sought ways to supplement their income. This view is supplemented by her various positive discourses and views of the Malays seen throughout her travel accounts. She admired the Malays and crucially made an important remark towards the end of her accounts that the Malays are certainly not industrious, for they have no need to be so. This suggests that she understands that the Malays were not being lazy or unindustrious by choice or through moral deficiency, but they were acting rationally by not needing to work beyond attaining their basic needs. So what implications can we draw from these findings? Firstly, it is safe to say that 19th century Malays were not lazy, and they simply acted rationally to respond to their environmental and social realities. In fact, the discourses and perceptions of laziness was largely contingent upon the individual life experiences and subjectivities of colonial agents. For Swettenham, it was his experiences in colonial administration and financial motivations, and for Bird, it was her empathy and position as a woman traveling through Malaya. Secondly, Alatas's arguments of colonial capitalism creating the myth of the lazy native was insufficient. Not everyone internalized colonial capitalistic ideals, and hence colonial capitalism cannot be the sole motivator for creating these supposed discourses of supposed laziness. Laziness was thus a superficial interpretation of Malay behavior, and in reality, colonial agents had a greater range and diversity in their opinions of the Malays. By narrowly focusing on ideologies, Alatas lacked nuance in engaging with colonial sources that complicated the realities of supposed Malay laziness. So I'd like now to move on to outlining how the NUS Libraries has assisted me in this research project. One of the key resources that helped me immensely was NUS Libraries' digital gems. These digitized sources formed the bulk of my primary source base and was an invaluable resource for me to scour for actual first editions of colonial writings, and which added much depth and detail to my source analyses and re-evaluations of colonial writings. These were just some of the sources that I utilized. Other NUS library collections were extensively utilized include the closed text, which provided me with additional primary and secondary sources such as Swettenham's memoirs and Anna Stoddard's early biography of Isabella Bird. The main Central Library books collection also provided me with critical secondary source materials such as Barlow's definitive academic biography of Swettenham and Pat Barr's biographical analysis of Bird's travels. Finally, the Malaysia-Singapore collection and RBR collections provided me with materials which deepened my research on the context of Malaya in the 19th century. Additionally, through this fellowship, I contributed towards expanding the library's collection through requesting these new materials as well. Finally, allow me to share some final takeaways from this fellowship. Firstly, this fellowship was instrumental in assisting me in conducting literature reviews and identifying publications that would be useful for my research, and this helped me to develop confidence in conducting and identifying relevant sources to ensure that I have a good grasp of existing materials. Secondly, I was exposed to NUS Library's vast array of both online and physical resources that enabled me to expand my knowledge on the research topic. Finally, the support given in this fellowship greatly assisted me in my research journey, especially with the support of my librarian mentor, Diyana. Before I conclude, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the people that made this research possible. My honours thesis supervisor, Dr. Kelvin Lawrence, for inspiring me to pursue this honours thesis topic and for his constant support given throughout the course of this project. I would like to also thank my librarian mentor Diana for her invaluable inputs and administrative support during the fellowship, and the undergraduate research fellowship team at NUS Library that gave me the opportunity to showcase my research by awarding me with this fellowship to begin with. To conclude, I would like to share an extended quote from one of my favorite fiction novels, A Gentleman in Moscow by Amo Towles, that allowed me to summarize and capture the key idea of my project. After all, what can a first impression tell us about anyone we've just met for a minute in the lobby of a hotel? For that matter, what can a first impression tell us about anyone? Why, no more than a chord can tell us about Beethoven, or a brushstroke about Botticelli. By their very nature, human beings are so capricious, so complex, so delightfully contradictory, that they deserve not only our consideration, but our reconsideration, and our unwavering determination to withhold our opinion until we have engaged with them in every possible setting, at every possible hour. Thank you very much, and I hope you have enjoyed my sharing.
All right, thank you. So we've just heard from Lance. Okay, so it's really interesting that in trying to recontextualize Malay images through the lives of these administrators, he in fact further entrenched why it was a problematic view due to the way the colonial knowledge was being produced. Now we will call upon Eunice, who will talk about fluid boundaries, navigating Singapore water identity. Eunice, please.
Thank you, Diana. So I'll share my screen. Can everyone see my slides? Okay. So hi everyone. So I'm Eunice, a final year global studies major. So my presentation today will be summarizing my research, how I utilize the NUS collection, and my reflections of this fellowship. So my thesis actually explores the intersectionalities between Singapore's water identities and globalization. What inspired me to really look into this topic was when I took a water and sustainability class on exchange. It was then actually I realized that water is a very important aspect of Singaporean identity. So I decided to investigate how Singapore's water identities have been shaped by globalization. So in the process of researching my thesis, I found that there were three main aspects. I need to understand first the relationship between water and identity, what water means to Singapore, as well as the role in globalization or in shaping identity. So water is actually something very fundamental to all of us humans and plays a really big role in cultivating our individual and collective identities. In the process of my research, I found that there were a few key gaps. So I found that water can shape identity in various ways, and it actually meant a lot of different things in the Singapore context. However, there was no literature connecting the relationship between water, globalization, and Singapore identity. So my thesis really sought to establish this relationship between the three things from scratch. So my thesis actually argues that Singapore's water identity is not a singular narrative, but rather a confluence of all these different things that different our identities, each shaped by globalization in their own way, while also being interconnected with one another. So my paper is actually inspired by a very prominent academic book, Robert and Lam's Six Phases of Globalization. And it actually talks about how globalization means different things to different people. Drawing from that conclusion, I wanted to showcase how Singapore's water identity also means different things to different people. I decided to make my methodology visuals. So my entire paper actually contained only visuals to show how, because I realized that seeing water in different forms visually was actually what makes Singaporean water identity so prominent. And it also made it really easy for you to understand how there are different water identities. So in my own research, I came up with 4 different water identities: a historical, existential, economic, and cultural. So I have not been able to cover all the different visuals that I actually used in my research, but I will cover the key ones. So for historical water identity, I focused a lot on Singapore's identity as a trading port. So the visuals that I chose were actually focused on how Singapore's ports used to be a place where local and foreign cultures interacted with one another. These visuals all showcase how there was actually a lot of networking, between different races and different kinds of people, which shows how actually globalization had already started from the early times in Singapore since we were a trading port. And after that, I decided to cover Singapore's existential water identity. So I think many of us Singaporeans are very familiar to the sensitive relationship between Singapore and Malaysia's water. So this section essentially covered the critical role of water in ensuring Singapore's survivability, our sovereignty, our economic development, as well as our social political stability. So in this section of my paper, I looked at water pipes in the causeway. I looked at the Lingu Dam and how looking at these different features and symbols of water actually reflected Singapore's vulnerability in water. Moving on, one of the most prominent identities in Singapore's water identity is its economic water identity. So there are two aspects to it. Firstly, the sustainability aspect. So Singapore paints itself as a global leader in the sphere of water. So this type of branding shows how Singapore's water is really necessary for tackling environmental sustainability and climate change. So I chose the Marina Barrage, which is Singapore's largest and most urbanized catchment. So I think the barrage embodies the idea that water is constructed to strengthen the country's international geopolitical influence, as well as an opportunity to enhance a lot of Singapore's international partnerships. Moving on, another dimension of Singapore's economic water is tourism. So my paper brings up one of these key examples as the Singapore River, because the Singapore River acts as a very good focal point of transition, where it used to be a historical center point for trade. However, after the intense Singapore River cleanup, it has just become a tourist site. So this section talks about how economic pursuits become a priority that overrides a lot of the other water identities, which similarly leads to a cultural water identity that I have created that represents water-based communities like the Orang Laut, who were often very marginalized and in my research, I found that they were erased to make way for modern infrastructure and urban development. So I focused on how visually there are nearly no traces of the Orang Laut today and what used to be their seaborne homes in Singapore. So here is a summary of the different water identities I've come up with in this thesis. So essentially, I looked at how the historical, economic, existential, and cultural waters all had some form of relationship with Singapore and globalization. So I tried to showcase the relationship between water, Singapore, and globalization in all three of my identities, while also showing that all four of these identities actually are very core to one another and they are very interconnected in how they developed and evolved into each other. So with globalization being so prominent today, it becomes really key to exploring and understanding the intricacies of these relationships, because my research shows how relationships can take form in various ways, even something as simple as water, and they come to shape other relationships and other different things in so many other and create so many other effects. And it is these sort of interactions and intricacies that actually becomes a core understanding of how our world is like today after globalization. So I sum up my thesis with like this really good quote by Toni Morrison that all water has perfect memory and it is forever trying to get back to where it is. So my thesis has really shown me that Singapore's water identity is not a singular stream, but rather a confluence of all these different things, each shaped by their own currents of globalization, and actually all flow back to the heart of the nation to create one singular Singapore water identity. So as Singapore continues to navigate the challenges and opportunities presented by globalization, its water story will undoubtedly continue to evolve, which was very evident from this year's National Day song, where Singapore River played a really big role, which really shows the dynamic interplay between like our Singaporean local experiences and globalization in the shaping of Singapore identity. So that is all for my research, and I'll be moving on to talking about the NUS collection that I utilized. So this fellowship really supported me, providing me a great variety of sources for my thesis to work with, and my mentors were really helpful and encouraging. So my thesis actually contains a broad range of sources, even beyond whatever I had included. I had a lot of things such as myths, stories, I had maps, I had lighthouses, a lot of other things that I have not been able to show. However, I would not have been able to get these sources without the use of NUS collection, like the ProQuest database, the library, and newspaper.sg. And besides my mentor's feedback and help with obtaining the sources, I could also access many research papers through the NUS collection to really develop my writing and also to focus my arguments, because my research is thoroughly original and I do not have a lot of theoretical frameworks to rely on. So moving on to my key reflections from this fellowship. So I think academically, this thesis and fellowship really pushed me to hone my academic research and writing to its best abilities, because my mentors would regularly check in with me on whether I needed any help with my data collection, my literature sourcing, or any reviewing. And I think the fact that me and my mentors were able to dig up like so many different sources, I actually realized that there were so many different type of academic sources that I could work with in this research that I had not even interacted with before. Personally, I think this fellowship was really great because it really cemented whether my topic was even meaningful. So the fact that my thesis got chosen as one of the important topics to be showcased, it really like told me and reassured me that, okay, whatever I'm researching does have meaning and is important. So I think that overall, this entire fellowship process has really been amazing. And I would like to thank my NUS Library for giving me this opportunity, as well as my mentors, Kawe and Gandhi, for always supporting me and checking in on me. I would also like to thank my thesis supervisor, Dr. Marina, as well as all the global studies professors that have taught me in NUS. And thank you to everyone here as well for listening, because it really makes all our presentations worthwhile. Thank you.
Thank you, Eunice. Of course, all the topics here are very impactful in their own way, and I think Eunice has managed to bring to the fore the narratives that are always in the periphery. When we talk about water, we talk about history, we talk about the economy, but we rarely talk about the cultural marginalization that took place to make Singapore the water hub that it is today. All right. Now we'll be moving on to Jordan. Jordan also cannot join us today, so we'll be sharing a video of his pre-recorded session.
Good day everyone, my name is Jordan. I'm a third year architecture student. I'll be presenting on my research project, The Built Language of Inequality, an urban case study on Marine Parade. Urban inequality can be defined by the disparities in wealth, income, access to resources, opportunities, and quality of life within urban areas. It is correlated to education, healthcare, social networks, employment opportunities, amongst other things. Despite a small landmass, urban inequality does persist in its own unique forms in Singapore, and so this research, a study on the relationship between built forms and inequality, is relevant, especially considering that there has been little to no study done to understand how the built forms in our urban environment are correlated to these disparities. Particularly, my research is also interested in investigating how built expressions or forms or languages can be responsible in influencing one's sense of self, experiences, and life outcomes. Eventually, I started to ask myself how all my findings could come together and inform a wider understanding of the Singaporean condition of inequality, or how these built languages are expressed uniquely in Singapore's urban environment. Marine Parade was chosen as the site for my case study, acting as a precursor to the wider understanding of Singapore's condition of inequality. Statistically, it is one of the most unequal neighborhoods in Singapore in terms of wealth and income, and so I was interested to see how these statistical finding is being played out in the built environment of Marine Parade. Historically, Marine Parade was a housing estate for wealthy Peranakan families. It wasn't until the 1960s that the Singapore government began a public housing project on this reclaimed land. Hence, this dialogue between the public housing estate as a tabula rasa and the enduring private ownership of land in the private housing estate became another reason why I picked Marine Parade as my case study initially, as it underscores a certain intentionality when it came to the design of Marine Parade and possibly that of urban inequality. Due to Singapore's high density, heterogeneity, and complexity, understanding its urban inequalities requires studying urban adjacencies at a micro level. The theories in transect urbanism, reading in the human ecology, are relevant, as the transect method documents and categorizes changes in urban environments, explaining the relationships, interdependencies, and interactions between different urban types. Using the of seeing and understanding different forms of urban inequality. Here is a plan of my chosen area in Marine Parade with the dashed line indicating the transact path and the 5 dotted boxes indicating the 5 urban types, which are Area A, public housing, Area B, market and hawker, Area C, institution, Area D, park/green corridor, and lastly Area E, private housing. The first theme that I'd like to touch on is permeability. Permeability is important in the urban makeup to promote ease of movement, legibility, accessibility, and connectivity. A highly permeable urban form broadens one's capacity to navigate space, exercise choices, access resources, and interact with urban happenings. In understanding changes in permeability along the chosen transact, a figure ground and sectional study is deployed as tools for formal analysis. Now, I shall quickly bring you through area by area how these built languages changes throughout the transact and its relationship with unequalness and disparities. At the start of the transact, Area A's urban pattern can be characterized as open, ambiguous, and less orderly. People can freely navigate through the spaces with ease. Due to a lack of order, boundary, and formal determinism, this encourages people to co-determine or appropriate the spaces in Area A, such as conducting free play at the open grass field and loitering at the HDB void decks. This quality of permeability changes in Area B, where the urban pattern is more defined and dense, which indicates a certain level of organization and control in urban movement, happenings, and other social processes. In Area C, we see that impermeability in the gated compounds of the school breaks the continuity of public movement, which reduces the ease of access to the wider urbanity. At times, it is permeability in the form of, for example, the open car parks that are intended to increase the connectivity for other social spatial groups, particularly vehicle owners in other areas of the transact, instead of serving its proximate users. In Area D and E, the impermeability is manifested through the barricading of buildings and spaces and thus the privatization of resources. It suggests a transitionary and deterministic occupation of space, such as walking and cycling. It limits the freedom of movement and larger social congregations in the area. This sense of seclusion in Area D and E discourage crossovers and limit possible meaningful happenings between people from different areas of the transact. In totality, we see how the spatial conditions of permeability can be understood across different spectrums from Area A to E. Permeability as a built language shapes legibility, accessibility, spatial determinism, and connectivity. Thus, this unequal quality of permeability suggests that different demographic groups and areas possess different capacities and experiences when consuming spaces. Such differences may discourage or serve as resistance to intermingling between different social spatial groups. Permeability can also facilitate exclusion and privatization of certain social spatial groups in the area and become tools to limit and resist access to spaces and resources, thus contributing to an unequal playing field in society. The second theme that I would like to touch on briefly is organization, in particular how the organization of urban spaces can influence the unequal distribution of economic opportunities, resources, interminglings, power, and access. The study is achieved through the lens of space syntax to observe how spaces are connected, accessed, controlled, and powered in their experiential outcomes. Space syntax is a technique used to analyze spatial layouts and human movement by representing spaces and circulation as graph or networks of choices. Once again, I'll bring you along the transact, starting with how Area A and B share the same spatial organization structure of distributedness. Distributedness is a quality characterized by the availability of choices to access all spaces in an area. Both areas encourage free accessible movement within an interconnected network of urban spaces. Social patterns in this area are likely to be frequent and they make up the everyday experience and urban culture of this area. This sense of place is rather absent in comparison with Area C, where the urban spaces are not meaningfully connected to one another. It is also not directly accessible by other social spatial groups along the transact. This network of unlinked spaces discourage free and frequent communication, thus reducing the opportunity for intermingling and dense encounters between different social spatial groups. On the other hand, both Area D and E is composed by barricaded spaces that privatize and limit the use of amenities and space, thus providing fewer reasons to visit the area other than for recreational and circulatory means. The organization structure for both areas is slightly different. In Area D, spaces are organized linearly to which the control over movement and social happenings are imposed. Freedom of choice making is limited and urban connections are blurred. While in Area E, the organization structure is almost like a branch-like network. Due to the privatization of amenities on a household level, the social patterns by nature do not encourage mass congregation in the area. Urban spaces perform as isolated singularities and are almost unlinked to one another. Hence, they do not promote free, frequent, and dense encounters even within their own social spatial groups. Conversely, the deep positioning of public spaces in Area E would privilege the social spatial groups in this area, serving as a means to homogenize and exclusivize any interactions. In totality, we see how the organization structures of spaces changes from area A to E. Organization as a built language of urban inequality can be understood through its distributedness, or how interconnected and accessible the spaces are to one another, proximity and positioning, network structures, and boundaries. It impacts 1, the ease, frequency, and types of interaction between different demographic groups, thereby influencing social cohesiveness. 2, one's capacity of choices and to make choices in consuming spaces. 3, one's sense of identity, belonging, capacities, and relatability to different spaces of culture. And lastly, 4, their ability to perceive, anticipate, and engage in urban happenings. These effects are felt disproportionately by different social spatial groups in the transact, as relationships within organizational structures changes along the transact. The arguments and analysis I've presented shows how these spectrums of built languages are manifested across different scales and areas of the transact. Therefore, it facilitates imbalances, differences, and unequalness even in the most subtle of ways, which highlights the pervasiveness of inequality in a dense, complex, and heterogeneous urban environment like Singapore. My research also notes that urban inequality has both a distribution outcome in terms of power, resources, opportunities, and social networks, and an experiential outcome with relation to one's sense of dignity, belonging, ownership, and empowerment. This ultimately affects the everyday experience and life outcomes of different demographic groups in an urban area. Lastly, if we were to look at how urban inequality is conceived as a complex system, spatial system of agglomerative relationships operating at different scale, thus this underscores a certain intentionality in the act of designing for inequality. With that, I would like to end off my presentation by acknowledging my research supervisor, Professor Lee Kawi, and the NUS Libraries for offering me this fellowship and the generous guidance throughout my research. Thank you.
Okay, so we've heard from Jordan, very interesting, that he's using building and spatial planning to add depth to the discourse on social inequality. Now, I'd like to invite Maximilian to talk about his research on
Very good.
ASEAN and human rights. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, give me a second. Hi. Okay. So as mentioned, my presentation is on ASEAN human rights, whether they are fundamentally irreconcilable or whether they are work in progress. More broadly, it's couched in the question of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivators for regional human rights engagement. For context, I'm a year 4 politics, philosophy, and economics student. And this thesis was done under the Department of Philosophy. Okay, so first, a brief outline of my project. So this thesis uses ASEAN as a background study. And it puts forth 2 primary arguments. First, it identifies that intrinsic motivators for regional organizations to adopt greater human rights standards are severely weakened by the non-universality of human rights, which is shared largely among non-Western states given the Western origins of human rights and its efficacy. So as will be covered later on, this is exemplified by an exploration of the reasons for ASEAN's hesitancy towards human rights. Second, the thesis will argue that extrinsic motivators may provide stronger impetus than intrinsic motivators for regional organizations to adopt greater human rights standards. So for ASEAN, the growing incongruency between ASEAN's human rights-oriented normative character and its declining human rights landscape debilitates their legitimacy and aspirations of centrality, which the thesis argues to be its strongest motivator to revamp its human rights regime. So it's briefly worthy to note here that the scope of my thesis has shifted slightly from when I first proposed it to the library. So there's a disparity between the present scope and the abstract in the library publicity materials. So the project was initially focused solely on ASEAN and human rights, but to accommodate a broader interdisciplinary perspective necessary for PPE thesis, ASEAN was used as a case study to explore the broader question of the differing efficacies of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivators and compelling regional organizations to improve human rights standards, which I believe is a timely philosophical question that's often overlooked in the literature. Okay, so moving on to some background information. So first, what is the relation between regional organizations and human rights? So arguments that regional organizations have a duty to uphold human rights have 2 parts. So firstly, regional organizations are argued to be uniquely suited for the promotion and protection of human rights and should thus lead development of regional human rights strategies. So this is because regional organizations are more attuned to the nuances of specific regions and are therefore better situated to place universal human rights obligations within the relevant regional context and ensure a shared regional interpretation. Regional bodies also tend to have stronger incentives to promote and protect human rights within the region, since severe violations within individual member states often have spillover effects that affect all members of the region. These arguments then draw upon the intrinsic moral value of human rights to establish why regional organizations should promote human rights. Such arguments takes either of two routes: that human rights are essential for securing basic human interests necessary for leading a minimally good life, or because of the intrinsic moral value derived from the capacity for freedom or autonomy. The problem with such arguments, however, is that the lack of consensus on the universality of human rights arguments and their moral worth. So ROs that fail to substantially engage with human rights generally contend they do not have a moral duty because their perceived moral value does not sufficiently necessitate explicit focus. So the reasons for such views emanate from relativist arguments, as exemplified by ASEAN. This includes an inability to identify the predominant Western philosophical grounding that human rights is conceptually reflective of the conditions and values of Western societies, and their exclusion from the initially Western-driven human rights advocacy. So given the disputed universality of human rights, one of this thesis' core arguments is that extrinsic motivators beyond the moral value of human rights, that is, intrinsic factors, may offer more compelling reasons for regional organizations to prioritize human rights. So for the purposes of these theses, extrinsic and intrinsic motivators are defined as follows. Extrinsic motivators refer to external factors or incentives that drive regional organizations to adopt and enforce human rights policies. So generally, these are factors that align and regional organization incentives, such as promoting and protecting human rights become in its interests. So conversely, intrinsic motivators refer to the intrinsic moral value of human rights, insofar that regional organizations pursue more substantive engagement with human rights because of a genuine belief in its cruciality and moral worth. While both can motivate regional organizations to adopt better human rights standards, the degree and quality of engagement effected can differ. Without genuine subscription to the intrinsic moral value of human rights, for example, extrinsic motivators may lead to an inconsistent engagement. They may also motivate superficial compliance, as opposed to intrinsic motivators, which are better able to foster a deeper and longer-term commitment and drive systematic reform in their appeal to fundamental moral principles and values. Nonetheless, this thesis argues that human rights advocacy cannot rely solely on intrinsic moral motivators. Specifically, extrinsic motivators are necessitated because, among other factors, non-Western states such as ASEAN are shown to struggle to fundamentally identify with human rights. Okay, so why ASEAN is a case study? So ASEAN is a relatively young regional organization with its human rights institutions and frameworks still in their formative years. ASEAN's motivations for human rights engagement are likely to be a product of ongoing negotiations. ASEAN additionally provides the ideal backdrop for the study, since it is presently at a crisis point, whereby its continued inability to resolve the Myanmar conflicts invites external scrutiny and external questions upon its human rights regime. This can be contrasted against intrinsic motivators, such as to access which may better compel ASEAN to rectify human rights problems. And third, ASEAN's diverse membership and regional context interests that it faces a set of difficulties that, while unique, are representative of the different obstacles regional organizations may face towards more substantial human rights engagements, thereby entailing that efficacy of intrinsic and extrinsic motivators, when applied to it, can be extrapolated across different regional organizations. So for context, here is a brief outline of the major milestones of ASEAN's engagement in human rights, but in the interest of time, this will not be covered. What is of note here, however, is that human rights have been increasingly addressed at the regional level by ASEAN, including through its institutionalization in the ASEAN Charter, establishment of a regional human rights body, which is AICHA, and the adoption of the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration. So ASEAN has therefore adopted a distinctive human rights-centered normative character. Okay, so despite this growth in normative character, however, ASEAN faces a deteriorating human rights landscape, while the human rights institutions that are established are largely ineffective in practice. So this has given rise to what is termed the action identity gap, whereby its normative human rights focused identity is matched disproportionately with a deterioration in the human rights standards. So first, human rights environments within ASEAN member states remain little change or significantly worsened since the establishment of the ASEAN Charter in 2008, thereby exhibiting ASEAN's continued tenuous relationship with human rights. Now, secondly, this also contributed by its human rights institutions, which are ineffective in practice. This is primarily because its human rights agenda was developed within a restricted framework, given the continued reservations of individual ASEAN member states, which will translate into practical constraints on its human rights institutions. AICHA's TOR, for example, echoes the same cautious attitude where commitments to human rights is undermined by a commitment to respecting the independence, sovereignty, equality, and centrality of non-interference of ASEAN member states. AICHA's mandate also kind of caters for the promotion aspect in much greater detail than the protection one, leading to criticism that is toothless and ineffective. Now, in a similar vein, the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration has also been criticized for undermining rather than affirming international human rights standards. So why is there a gap? So first, it is generally recognized that human rights is and continues to be promoted in ASEAN for its instrumental value. So in this section, I do draw quite a bit on the present literature. So Davis and Irene, for example, argue that ASEAN's promotion of human rights norms were part of a broader project of regional reform in 1997 after the Asian financial crisis. Katsumata argues that ASEAN human rights engagement has been a process of mimetic of adoption to legitimize itself by releasing Western states in the organizations. More fundamentally, however, ASEAN member states' uncertain and differentiated commitments stem from the differentiated centrality of human rights and national experiences, which include self-determination, nation building, the resultant constitutionalization of right protection. Human rights in ASEAN continue to be perceived as imperialistic, given the Western origins of human rights advocacy and the conditionality of foreign aid. Together, the limited encounters of ASEAN member states with human rights and nation building and the skepticism of human rights entail that they currently have an inability to identify with human rights' intrinsic moral value. Now, this has resulted in ASEAN habitually subverting the ASEAN way to constrain the development of a more rigorous regional human rights policy. The ASEAN way is presented by ASEAN as a distinctive approach to interstate relations and regional cooperation and constitutes a unique methodology. So, for example, the principle of non-interference entails that sovereignty-minded ASEAN member states are hesitant to even publicly criticize states that violate human rights, since undermining the principle we set a precedent for external intervention in their own affairs. The other two principles, consensus decision-making and the preference for informal practices, are shown in the slide above. Okay. So going back to the original question of extrinsic versus intrinsic motivators. So ASEAN's continued inability to effect improvements amid the Myanmar crisis spotlights two issues. That ASEAN continues to lack substantive or effective measures to protect human rights despite its institutionalization, and the ASEAN member states are unaligned in ASEAN's engagement with human rights thus far. So there is now a growing necessity for ASEAN to reconsider its human rights regime. While difficult to find a driving force to do so, the core argument here is that the threats of ASEAN's action identity gap to its credibility poses sufficient impetus. This is because, as the thesis argues, ASEAN member states' skepticism of human rights entail that the intrinsic motivators are likely to be effective in catalyzing greater human rights engagement. Furthermore, and more importantly, ASEAN has been habitually demonstrating that strong external pressure, especially when its legitimacy or credibility comes under threat, is sufficient to catalyze action. So in conclusion, the thesis makes two primary arguments. First, that contestations of the universality of human rights undermine intrinsic motivators, and second, that extrinsic motivators may provide stronger impetus than intrinsic motivators for regional organizations to adopt greater human rights standards. ASEAN's inability to identify the intrinsic moral value of human rights is one that is shared by many, particularly non-Western states, considering that the argument that extrinsic motivators can better compel ASEAN to reconsider its human rights regime than intrinsic motivators can be extrapolated to other regional organizations without compromising its validity. This is primarily because the initial human rights advocacy and its codification in international law were Western-dominated endeavours with non-Western states situated peripherally throughout the process, thereby contributing to their present inability to identify the philosophical foundations and moral impetus of human rights. This thesis, however, notes that extrinsic motivators, however, are insufficient for long-term and meaningful engagement with human rights, exemplified by ASEAN's present human rights engagement, and thus must be complemented with a genuine engagement with the moral value of human rights as evidenced by ASEAN, but this is oriented more towards the long term. Okay, so moving on to the last part. So how has this project benefited from the NUS Undergraduate Research Library Fellowship? So first, the provision of the stipend was instrumental in the writing of my thesis, in part because it provided me the funding to gain access to paywall resources, and also because it accorded me the financial freedom to focus on it. While the political science department does afford modules on research methodologies and modeling how to write a research paper, one aspect of my education at NUS that was perhaps lacking was the absence of formal instruction with regards to research sources. So having a set of members from the NUS libraries were extremely helpful in that regard. So my mentors pointed me to journal databases such as the International Political Science Abstracts and dissertation databases such as ProQuest, and taught me how to use them effectively to supplement my research. It was extremely helpful in writing my thesis. Both my mentors were also extremely helpful in navigating the many resources that NUS Libraries provides to students, and their dedicated support of my research gave me the confidence to be more ambitious in the scope of my thesis. On a similar note to the NUS Libraries Singapore Malaysia collection, especially its well-curated ASEAN corner, proved to be an invaluable resource through the course of my research. In particular, the centralization of resources in one dedicated space and the diversity of resources available provided a convenient means for me to explore alternative sources and perspectives in my research. So last but not least, was the provision of a dedicated space in the library for me to work on my thesis. That was perhaps the most useful during the examination season, where the library was constantly packed and really gave me a space to sit down and write. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Maximilian. So indeed, human rights is a fundamental component in which ASEAN has to focus on. All right, so moving forward, Liu Rong will now conclude the sharing with her research on the stories of disconnections at Bukit Brown Cemetery. Liu Rong, please.
Okay, thank you so much. Hi everyone, good afternoon. So today I'll be sharing on my research at the field site of Bukit Brown Cemetery. As you can see here, the title of the project is called Between Two Worlds, Stories of Disconnections at Bukit Brown Cemetery. I would like to take this opportunity to thank my supervisor, Dr. Ivan Kwek from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and also my library mentors, Gaten and Li Jing. Here is an overview of my presentation today. So I'll first go through why Bukit Brown and what is Bukit Brown Cemetery. And following that, I will cover the main points I have raised in my thesis. And finally, to share a little bit on my fellowship journey. So first of all, why Bukit Brown and what is Bukit Brown? I have actually come to encounter Bukit Brown Cemetery a couple of times in my undergraduate years. And before these encounters, I have never known the existence of Bukit Brown Cemetery. The first one is in year 2021, where my Chinese professor from the Chinese department who offered this course called Social Political History of Modern China. And they introduced us to the tour organized by All Things Bukit Brown, which is an advocacy group who is still very active nowadays to offer tours on the theme of women in the Straits settlement. The second encounter is in year 2022, a private trip to explore regional and local religion deities for another project for Southeast Asia religion. And finally, the nature and ongoing activities and communities at Bukit Brown in year 2022 as well, and then my thesis in 2023 and 2024. So from this list of my encounters, you'll realize one thing. Each time when I enter the space of Bukit Brown Cemetery, it is of a different topic. And this suggests one very important thing that will be important to hold on to understand my sharing of my thesis later, is that there is no such thing as one Bukit Brown. And each time when I'm introduced to it in a certain particular meaning to connect to Bukit Brown in this meaning. So now I would like you to take a second to think about, when you hear the name Bukit Brown Cemetery, what is the first key term or image that comes to your mind? Okay, hold on to these terms and image, and as I'm going to share later. So through my process of research, I have encountered various interlocutors and also doing field work, also engaging with the sources online, such as the Facebook community, the blogs written by the different advocacy group over Bukit Brown, as well as the various literature that is written about Bukit Brown Cemetery. I come up with this list of key terms. It's not all of it, but it's the most repeated ones. There is Chinese diaspora, culture, religion, nature, community. And for those who have already heard about Bukit Brown Cemetery before, you will never miss this term, heritage. And these lead to the key argument of my thesis, which is on meaning making and connections. So when you first heard about Bukit Brown Cemetery, there is that Bukit Brown. But how do you make connection with the space itself? Is through the kind of meaning that you're associating with it, whether it is an image that you're thinking, or it is that term that you're thinking in mind in terms of Bukit Brown as a cultural site, Bukit Brown as a heritage site. And in this meaning, you slowly form the connections. And as you have these connections, you have conversation with people, you'll think through the different interactions with people, and more meanings are produced. So that is what I'm going to talk about today. The question will be, how and when did the public become aware and connected with the existence of Bukit Brown? I have tried to list down this bunch of short timeline here, which is popularly recognized when you key in Bukit Brown on Google or reading the different literatures that is out there. But for today's presentation, I want you to just focus on the last two timeframes I'm offered here. So the 1921 and the 1922, and as well as the 2011. So what's happening here is Bukit Brown so the space Bukit Brown is acquired by the British municipal government and established as a Chinese public cemetery in 1922 and officially closed for burial in 1973. And interestingly, the next time date I give you here is 2011, when the Singapore government announced a plan to redevelop the cemetery to build highways and establish a new housing estate, and thus causing an outbreak of public outcry led by active advocacy groups and individuals. So this is interesting because between 1973 and 2011, there is about 40 years of gap. And according to my research, in these 40 years of gap, Bukit Brown Cemetery is rather invisible, or a little bit neglected, forgotten by the general public. They are absent from the public consciousness. So when I say forgotten, it doesn't mean that Bukit Brown Cemetery is a complete dead space where there's no activity. That is definitely not true, because there are pockets of communities such as nature lover, animal lover, like bird watchers, the descendants of the cemetery, the grave, like the ancestor, when they go there to pay respect to the ancestor in Qingming or different dates of the year, the culture lover, religion lover, all of these communities that exist, but they exist in their own pockets. And for those who are not engaged or known of like Bukit Brown Cemetery, which is the general public I'm speaking here, they are unaware of its existence. And that is what we call in sociology in the term of social amnesia. So the question to be asked here is that, why did a cemetery that is kind of absent from our public consciousness for 40 years gain so much attention from the public? I'm pretty sure all of you here somewhat could have possibly like see it on the news or on the internet somewhere as a heritage site. And that is my argument here. I believe that one of the big reasons why Bukit Brown Cemetery managed to gain so much attention from the public is because it is being associated with the idea of national heritage. This is a big meaning attached to Bukit Brown Cemetery that allow it to attach itself and connect itself to the general public. So two things has been achieved here. The first thing is cemetery clearance in Singapore is not really a new thing, because we know there's Bidadari and many of the other cemetery that is being cleared and assumed for the development of Singapore in urban planning. So what made Bukit Brown special in this sense? The cemeteries in the past that is being cleared, they also have people voicing out the need to preserve it. But as I have said, those actually happens in very small pockets of groups. It's either the descendants, the nature lover, but they sounds like they are more of like fighting their own war in their own frame, and that can lead to scattered forces. So they didn't really attract much attention from the public. They also didn't really have much forces to counter a government action. But by bringing in the idea of heritage, all these different pockets of community managed to come together to become an allied advocacy group to fight for its preservation. And that is why it becomes so visible to the government and also becomes so visible to the public. And the second one that is being achieved here is also another story about meaning making and connection. And that it is, so when the public look at the past cemetery that is being cleared, we're kind of viewing, okay, these people's graves are being dug up, but I am not the descendant. Maybe it's not my business. I couldn't really connect with them. But now that Bukit Brown Cemetery is given the title of heritage, I'm sure if I ask you, what is heritage? You probably can't give me a clean definition of what that is, but you'll surely have the subconscious thoughts that, oh, we need to protect it because it's our national heritage. And that gives a link to the general public who might think that they're outsider to be included in this conversation, and thus all coming together to call for its preservation. So that is a story of Bukit Brown Cemetery of meaning making and connection in 2011. But now we are in 2024. So what has happened in the 13 years of time? So that, I'm just going to bring in one little thing here. That is, while Heritage in 2011 managed to incorporate different groups of people to come in to share their needs and desire and how they value Bukit Brown Cemetery using Heritage, over the years, we can see that government forces and also heritage experts coming in strongly to try to define what is heritage. And that is what we call in sociology authorized heritage discourse. Okay, not very fancy. Just think about someone who has the power to define what is heritage. And when we have someone in power to define what is heritage, what will happen next will be who will be included in this dominant narrative and who will be excluded. So those beautiful things happened before of all those inclusivity is going to go down a path of exclusion. And that leads to the final point of my thesis of discursive struggle. So in my interviews with my interlocutors, many of them actually shared their different needs that might not necessarily fit in very nicely in our conventional understanding of heritage. But because of this open space of heritage, they are able to share these needs, such as, oh, Bukit Brown Cemetery is not very manicured as compared to many of the other spaces in Singapore. There's no signpost, it's not really well managed. But because of this specialty of it, it gives them the sense of freedom, the freedom to interpret, the freedom to express. And of course, there's aesthetic value, the cultural value, and so on and so forth. But we have to keep in mind that Bukit Brown today is still kind of vulnerable because there is no hard decision made to say it is definitely going to be preserved, or is it going to be disappeared into another housing estate like Bishan, or is it going to be preserved as a kind of heritage site? For example, let's choose a few tombs to say this indicate the heritage because it is a pioneer of Singapore. But while that is being preserved, all the rest of the others become disappeared. They disappeared in this action. So to end off my presentation of my thesis, I would like to just to highlight that heritage making is an ongoing process, and in its performance and practices, the abstract concept of all these things, such as heritage in this case for Bukit Brown, is given the form and substance. Okay, now I'm going to share a little bit about the fellowship experience. I think I'm really thankful of this fellowship opportunity because, first of all, like all the others has shared, the utilization of library resources. I think it is important to understand that as undergraduate, we are very new researchers. So our research skills are kind of immature. We don't really know the sea of literature out there. You just don't really know where to go. And with the kind of skill set, you don't really know where is the community to go to find certain research sources and events that is ongoing. So the library fellowship, they actually come with a very supportive community. We have our mentors, such as for me is Gaten and Li Jing. We also get to meet up with the other researchers that is also under this program and also the other librarians in the library. And with this kind of supportive environment, it's very important for undergrad researcher who can be quite panicking when you first start off something that is so grand and big. And one more thing I think is very important about this fellowship is that the possibility and potentials of creative project. For me personally, I didn't have the time and energy to develop the creativity of my project other than it's just a thesis, but there is a possibility of podcasts and all those things as well. So for future fellowship recipients, you might want to take consideration of this as well. Then finally, it's an elevation of stress. So definitely the stipend is very, very helpful, especially for me. I need to go to the cemetery almost on a weekly basis and also to interview people before the stipend funding. It feels more like I have nothing to offer. So not to say that I'm giving them money, but at least I can interview them by offering them a meal. So over the meal, we can carry out the conversation, which is actually really helpful to have good and sincere interactions with people. So that comes to the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoy this. Thank you so much for coming.
All right, thank you, Lurong. It's unfortunate that even when you are dead, you still cannot escape from power structures and power play. All right, okay, so now we'll open the floor to audience. If you have any questions, please key in the Q&A. In the meantime, I think I'll ask if you can just share how the fellowship provided you with opportunities that you might not have had. during the course of your research?
Okay, I think for me it's really about having the creativity aspect of it, because I think that part is what strikes me as like quite interesting, because normally when you think about thesis writing or research project, you just vision a particular paper. But I think for this fellowship, they do encourage the creativity aspect of it, which you can write a paper and you continue to build onto it with the amount of like stipends you are given. You can push this to happen, like exhibition, if I'm not wrong, podcast as well, and so on and so forth. So I think that is something pretty special for someone who might not have the financial ability or space to do it, as compared to like having a team who can support you with this.
Liorong, we have a question for you here. Do you manage to interview any of the people, groups, or organizations responsible for the authoritative heritage narrative? And did they mention why they chose that specific narrative?
Okay, very tricky question. But I didn't manage to interview the Ming authorities. What I meant by that is like the government authorities. But I did manage to interact with advocacy groups and also go to conferences that is actually co-hosted by, for example, the Singapore Heritage Society and National Heritage Board, and also advocacy groups like All Things Bukit Brown. So through them, I think there is nothing much to say like why do they choose a certain particular narrative. It is mostly like what fits in the best in the current dominant narrative. So that make things smoother. And how do you negotiate the power between the rising voices from online, also from the different interlocutors I met, which is like the visitors to the Bukit Brown heritage tours. So you can see how through the interactions, narratives are built within this. So there is definitely someone who is more in power, but they also react to those who have lesser power in the power structure. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Then just another one quickly. Do you find that their age makes a difference in the attitude of the people towards Bukit Brown?
I think I think yes, because I can see a certain kind of trend. Who is most attracted to Bukit Brown, for example? I think based on the most people that I have engaged with, especially those people who is very active in protecting it, they usually come in the age of 40s and 50s. But over the years, you can see that the younger generation are getting more and more attracted to the space as well. Like there are more 20s, even like school kids from university, JC, primary school that used to hold this collaboration with the advocacy group to hold heritage tours to Bukit Brown. So I can see that while it is absent in the past, over the years, heritage actually has bring it into the sight of the public, and thus bringing in younger generations in as well. Yeah.
Alright, okay, thank you, Liu right, Eunice, there's a question here for you. Of your 4 water identities, which did you find to be your favorite or most significant research-wise? And were there other water identities that you wish you had looked deeper into?
Okay, thank you for the question. So, I think my favorite was really looking at the cultural waters, because that was one aspect that doesn't exist in literature at all. So I tried really hard to find whether there were any literature existing that showcase or talked about or summarized like any of our water communities that used to be in Singapore, but then I really had to make it from scratch. So there were a lot of other things such as boats, as well as like religious sites that were included in my actual thesis paper, not shared today. So that would be my favorite. And yeah, there are actually a lot more water identities that exist. For example, like the environmental identity. So I actually merged the environmental into the economic, but originally my research had it separate because I thought that it had a lot of other things such as like our gardens by the bay also. Yeah. Furthermore, there was also a lot of expansion for my topic that could go into things like transboundary sites as well as islands. So one aspect of my research that I unfortunately did not cover was islands and how they shape water identity in Singapore as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Eunice. Okay, let's take a look. Okay. There's a question here. Are there any plans for you to expand your research in the future? And which aspects exactly would you like? Like Eunice just now mentioned that she want to look more at the cultural water identity bit, right? What about Daksha or Maximilian?
Yeah. Okay, so for me, I'm interested in analyzing MDW groups of other nationalities. So obviously I focus on Sri Lankan migrant domestic workers in my paper, but I would love to interview Filipino migrant domestic workers, Indonesian migrant domestic workers, Thai, Burmese, and the list goes on. And I think it'd be interesting to understand whether they respond and interact with the law differently, and whether this is owed to sort of cultural aspects and things like that. I think that would be an interesting comparison to make. And I hope to maybe publish that sometime, because I think it can really inform policy reform. For instance, like during my research, I actually found that, you know, the role of the law is like in shaping MDW's identities and their sense of self, as well as how employers actually treat their migrant domestic workers. So while obviously it's important for MDWs to have like certain ways and legal mechanisms to enforce their rights, they're less likely to do that. But that doesn't mean that the law is unhelpful, because it can really affect their tolerance for abuse, for instance, and when they walk away from an abusive situation. And this can, I think, really alleviate the sort of domestic abuse cases that we see in the news quite unfortunately. So yes, that's where I'm hoping to bring my research with this.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Annie. All right, Max, there's one for you here. The participant is asking, do you think the case holds true for other non-Western ROs like the Arab League? And what about the majority of non-Western regional organizations with a Western superpower like Pacific Islands Forum and OAS?
I do think it holds, because many of the regional organizations do show differentiated commitment towards human rights. Perhaps the same factors do not hold, but I think ultimately what does matter is the study of whether intrinsic versus extrinsic motivators are more effective in compelling human rights to better the human rights standards. I do think that in the short term, the way to promote human rights standards for these regional organizations do tend towards extrinsic motivators, as the internal motivator project is one that's oriented towards the long term. To answer the previous question as to whether I do have plans to expand on this research, I'm going to policy making. So for the meantime, I don't think this will be an area that I will focus on very much. But I remain very interested in foreign affairs and Singapore's international relations with its members, particularly ASEAN. So I would like to pursue a stint in MFA or foreign affairs in the future. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, so are there any last questions or any comments from our fellows? Would you like to say any last words?
Sorry, can I just say one more thing to the
Sure.
first question? For those who are interested to find out the authoritative voice for their stance, actually it's very easy. You can just go to their website. They have a lot of things there. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. So that's it from us. Once again, I would like to thank all our fellows, our participants today, and not forgetting our library mentors for the support that you have provided to our fellows. If you're interested to find out more about the fellowship, or if you'd like to apply for the future iteration, all you have to do is when we close this sharing session, there will be a pop-up for feedback. In the comment section, just indicate your interest and we will get back to you. All right, so that's it. Thank you so much, everybody.